Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to each and every one of you who are joining us from around the world tonight for our weekly Stories and Myths program. I'm here with the smiling and waving John C. Farrell. How are you, John C. Farrell?
I'm doing well, doing well. Just a little frustrated with traffic, but other than that, I'm doing good.
Well, and it's not only traffic that we're dealing with. Now we're dealing with this pipeline shutdown this week. And we have gotten word that it was a ransomware attack. On the way home, I was listening to the news, and they believe that it came from Russia.
Oh, wow.
Although they don't know that, they don't believe that it was from the government. But when you're talking about Russia, who knows? There is also a very strong indication that the Colonial Pipeline paid $5 million ransom in order to get the pipeline back up. That is what I've heard from a few different sources. This is not a good thing. No. It's not good for America right now, obviously, but this whole aspect of being able to have a vitally important pipeline held hostage is very, very concerning.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, the pipeline is one of the main carriers of gas and fuel to the Carolinas, where both Craig and I live. So it's kind of been a local hot topic here, and I don't know how far-reaching it's got outside of the Carolinas, but
as of yesterday, 70% of the gas stations in Charlotte had no gas. And I know that the gas stations around where we work were all shut down. Mm-hmm. And tonight on my way back to the house, I did notice a couple of gas stations were open. They had long lines, but at least they were open. So
I think on my commute, because we go in opposite directions, it was kind of hit or miss. There might have been one station that was open, and then the very next one would be closed. And it was kind of 50-50 if looking at it. I'd stop that one to top off, and it was closed, or the pumps were shut off. But what is your current gas situation, Craig, in your car? Are you okay on gas?
I have 3/4 of a tank, because the other day, you remember, we were in the hall and one of our coworkers said, "You better go fill up." And the good news of that is I was on total fumes, and I had meant to get gas that morning, and I was running late. And so I got to work with almost no gas. I probably would not have made it home that night. So I'm so glad that our coworker told us to get gas. So I sat in line for a half hour and I filled the tank. And so now I have 3/4 of a tank, but I'm supposed to go to my daughter's graduation party in Virginia this weekend, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to go or not. We'll see.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to hear next week if you did go or not.
Yeah,
but, I know oblivious to the situation, I had filled up my car on Monday, and but I drive an hour and 15 minutes one way to go to work. So I do get a lot of gas mileage, or I do burn a lot of gas in my commute. And so I actually drove around my little area where I live last night and finally found one location that was open, but they had a 20-minute or a $20 limit that you could get, which is fine. Because I still had good enough mileage or good enough gas to get to work today and probably tomorrow morning, but I knew I wouldn't get home tomorrow afternoon. So I was like, $20 is good. So I know I'm good for this week, for the rest of this week, getting to work and getting home from work. So I'm good. I'm not at full, but yeah.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Yeah. So what do we got on tap for tonight, John?
So we're gonna first start off with a question that Kelly Williams Duncan asked at the very end of our last session, which wasn't last week. We had taken the week off for various reasons, and we are so that's what we're going to start off with at the beginning, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the situation that's happening in Israel, and you can kind of speak to this a lot more than I can, because you have written a book called "I Am Cyrus: Harry S. Truman and the Rebirth of Israel," and so it'll be interesting to get your insight on that whole issue. There it is, the Mr. Dr. Craig Von Busick. So, and so we're going to start off with Kelly Williams Duncan's question from our last conversation. But first, I want to say hi to whoever's listening, and specific Kelly Williams Duncan, who is chatting in the chat comments. And she says her son works near DC and very little available supply. I actually worked in DC in Northern Virginia for a number of years, and I commuted an hour and a half one way to work. So I'm sure that I would have, if I still lived up there, I would be in a herd of trouble. But anyway, so we'll get to the question that Kelly Williams Duncan asked last time, unless you have anything else to say, Craig.
Nope. Shoot.
Good deal. So she wanted to know, did Grant return to the Army at Lincoln's request, or was there some other, or what was that connection?
Well, first of all, let me give a little bit of background for those who don't know what had happened. In 1853, Ulysses S. Grant was stationed on the West Coast in Northern California, and he was missing his wife and his two sons terribly. He had tried everything he could to bring them out to the West Coast, but this was before there was an transcontinental railroad, I should say. And so it was very expensive and very dangerous to do so. And so he got so depressed that he turned to the bottle. And Grant was very thin and rather short. He was, last week, I think I made him too short. I think he was 5'8", but he was very thin, about 130 pounds. So he was a small person. And so he could, if he drank, he would get drunk very quickly. But he also had an alcoholic tendency. So if he started drinking, he would keep drinking. And unfortunately, he had been caught being drunk one too many times on duty. And he was forced to decide whether he was going to be court-martialed or whether he would resign. And so he couldn't imagine the idea of being court-martialed. And so he resigned in 1853, and he went back to St. Louis, where his father-in-law gave him some land to farm. And he worked very diligently on that farm. But unfortunately, right around that same time, there was a massive national financial depression. And so Grant was never successful as a farmer. And so he tried different things to make ends meet. He was a bill collector. He even tried selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis, and nothing really worked. And yet at the same time, he could see that the country was being torn apart by the issue of slavery. And he had been given a slave by his father-in-law, who worked with him on the farm. And at this point, Grant was in a very dire financial situation. But instead of selling that slave for $1,000, which would have been a lot of money in the 1850s, he gave that slave his freedom. And I believe, and a lot of historians believe, that that was the beginning of Grant's turn towards becoming an abolitionist and being firmly against slavery. And so not long after that, he packed up the kids, and he and Julia went up to Galena, Illinois, where Grant took a job in one of his father's leather goods store. His father had a chain of leather goods throughout the Midwest, leather goods stores throughout the Midwest. And so Grant was a clerk there, but a lot of people believe that he was just biding his time because he knew that the Civil War was coming. And so when the Civil War broke out, he went and offered his services to the governor of Illinois, Governor Yates. Now, this in answer to Kelly's question, at that point, Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant did not know each other. Even though Lincoln was from Illinois and Grant had moved to Illinois, they had never met, and they didn't meet until later. And so Grant went to Governor Yates and said, I believe that he had been a captain in the Army before. He was a hero of the Mexican War. And so he said, in light of his experience and his training, he thought that he would that it would be good for him to be named a colonel. And a lot of his peers were being promoted to colonel at that time because of the great need for leadership in the Civil War in the early days. But what had happened is that several people who knew Grant in the previous Army and knew that he had been pushed out because of his alcoholism, they went to Yates and said, "Don't hire him. He's a drunk and you won't be able to trust him." And so Grant was not able to get a commission. And so he just said, well, I'm going to wait around until a job opens up for me, and we'll see if I can get my foot in the door through that. Well, lo and behold, a job opened for him to be to muster in the new volunteers. And that was something that, a lot of the other officers felt was below them. But for Ulysses Grant, it was an opportunity. And he did it with excellence and with vigor. And so he worked diligently. And whenever anyone had a question, whether it was an officer or whether it was an enlisted person or whoever it was, Grant was always there with an answer. And so he was very quickly, he gained the respect of other officers, and he really gained the respect of these soldiers that he was mustering into the service. So Lincoln was not at all involved at this time. He was very, very busy in Washington, D.C., trying to get things organized and trying to raise an army, because so many of the officers had gone to the South. Many of the best officers became Confederate officers, and many of the soldiers that had been in the Army were stuck out west and were not able to leave their post to come east to fight the war. And so they literally didn't have an army in the Union at that time. And so they had to raise these troops. And so what happened is that they basically took whoever they could get to direct the troops and to become officers. And some of these officers were not very good. And so there was an officer of a particular regiment in Illinois, and he was a wimp, and he didn't know his job, and he was the colonel of this regiment. And so the soldiers, they could see that they could get away with a lot. And so there was not a lot of discipline, and there was not a lot of respect. The soldiers would leave at night.
Craig, can I interrupt you? Marlene Banks says that the video keeps freezing. Is there something on your end that you can help fix that? I'm looking on my end, but since you're originated, I just want to make sure that we don't keep on freezing.
We are rolling as far as I can tell on my side.
Marlene, let us know in the comments if it keeps on freezing, and we'll see what we can do. Hopefully it's not freezing anymore. But I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I figured I want to make sure that everyone's able to watch it.
Yeah, Kelly is saying that hers is good. So Marlene, it might be on your side of things. All right. So this particular colonel was not keeping discipline, and these soldiers would get drunk at night. They would go into town and raise hell. They set a chicken coop on fire, they stole chickens and eggs, and they set the guard shack on fire. That's what it was. And so what happened is the younger officers were getting quite fed up with this behavior, and also fed up with the officer, the colonel, who was not doing anything. And so they had worked with Ulysses S. Grant in mustering the soldiers in, and they had been greatly impressed with him. And so they went to Governor Yates and they said, this colonel of this regiment is a waste, and he's not fit for command. We want him fired, and our recommendation is that you bring Ulysses S. Grant in as the colonel of this regiment. Well, this was very good timing, because Grant had actually gone from Illinois to Ohio to speak with his old associate, General McClellan, who was rising up in the ranks. And Grant was trying to get McClellan to bring him onto his staff. Well, McClellan had remembered a time when they were out west, and Grant had gotten drunk when he was fitting out requisitions for McClellan, who was doing surveys for the Northwestern Railroad. And McClellan was kind of a martinet, everything by the book kind of soldier. And though Grant had been drinking, he got the whole requisition together completely and perfectly and on time. But McClellan never forgave him for being drunk. There are some of his fellow soldiers who said that Grant was actually ill and was taking some alcohol as a medication, but Grant couldn't handle his liquor, and so he appeared drunk. So McClellan was in the Cincinnati area, and Grant had gone to McClellan's office, and they said, "Oh, we're sorry, General McClellan is not available right now." And Grant said, "Well, I'll wait until he's available. I would like to speak to him. We knew each other in Mexico and out in the West Coast." And so for 2 full days, Ulysses S. Grant sat in the lobby outside of McClellan's office, and General McClellan would not see him. He snubbed him for 2 full days.
It's called persistence. That's persistence.
Well, he needed a job, and he also knew that, Grant was confident in his abilities. He was an excellent quartermaster. He was an excellent strategist, and he believed that he owed it to the government to offer his services because he had been trained for free at West Point. And so, but on the other hand, he also was looking for a job and looking to get back into the Army. And so after waiting 2 days for McClellan to talk to him, Grant finally gave up and was getting ready to head back to Illinois when he received a telegram from Governor Yates offering him a colonelcy for this regiment. Grant immediately telegraphed back accepting the offer, and he traveled to Illinois, and he immediately took charge. One of the things that he did was he didn't want the soldiers to know who he was at first. So for the first 2 days, he walked around the camp of this regiment in civilian clothes. And none of the soldiers, a few of the officers knew who he was, but he told them, "Don't salute me. I just want to look around and see what's going on." And he saw immediately what was happening. And so the 3rd day, he came in his full uniform, and he called everyone to attention. And he said, "My understanding is that this, and this has been going on. And let me just say to you that if you were to do this type of behavior during peacetime, that you would be arrested and spend, a significant amount of time at hard labor with a ball and chain around your leg. The penalty for doing this kind of thing that you've been doing during wartime is execution."
Wow.
That was his opening statement to the regiment.
Scared a lot of people, I bet.
Their behavior changed very dramatically.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
And the amazing thing is,
what things were they doing?
Well, like I had told you, they were getting drunk and being disorderly.
So it
They
was
were
just
going.
that.
Well, it sounds innocent, but when you're at war, you can't have that kind of behavior. You have
True.
to have your troops need to be on a state of full alertness. And so, they were going into town and stealing chickens and brawling and causing all kinds of problems. They burned the guard shack down from their drunken behavior. And so Grant basically said to them, I'm going to give you leniency this time, but it won't happen again. And so needless to say, that was the end of that. And in the long run, that regiment became one of the best regiments in the entire Illinois volunteers. And so Grant totally turned that situation around. And his leadership of that regiment was noticed by the federal commander overseeing the Western armies. And that was General Fremont, who, by the way, 4 years earlier had been the first Republican candidate for the presidency, and he lost to Buchanan. But Fremont was very impressed by Grant, and he went ahead and he promoted Grant to brigadier general. And so Grant went from a clerk in his father's leather goods store to a colonel to a brigadier general in like 6 months. And then a year later, he was a major general after Vicksburg. And then a year later, he became lieutenant general over 1 million men of all the armies of the Union. And within 4 years after that, he was president of the United States. So it's a remarkable climb, and really a role model for us today, and someone that we can look to for as a man of honor and a hero.
Right. Wow. So Kelly had a comment about stealing chickens and eggs and burning the guardhouse, and she also commented, "Wow." So yeah, that's a remarkable story. That's pretty cool. So, if you don't mind, we can go on to the next topic and spend most of the rest of the of our time here today, or tonight, or this morning, wherever you may be around the world.
It's today and everywhere.
Absolutely, right now. So, about something that's been in the news lately, and it relates to a book that you wrote a couple years ago, and it relates to the book "I Am Cyrus: Harry S. Truman and the Rebirth of Israel." There it is, people. When did that book come out?
2018. So no, 2019. It's 2 years old.
All right, what was your inspiration behind writing that book? What was the reason you felt compelled to write that?
In 1988. Were you born yet? 1988.
I was in elementary school.
Elementary school. All right.
Yes.
Well,
Yes,
in 1988, I was given a cassette tape. Cassette tapes they were made out of plastic.
I don't know what 8-tracks are, but I know where I wasn't around for 8-tracks, but I was around for records and cassette tapes.
All right. So and also telling other people in the audience who might not know, cassette tapes were a wonderful thing for a long time.
That was a personal jab at me. I know.
I didn't hear what you said.
I said that was a personal jab at me. I know.
Oh, no. I'm saying others in the audience might not know. So you obviously know what a cassette tape was.
Well, you thought I wasn't alive in 1988.
I don't keep track of your, birthday date, the year of your birthday.
I was an old man of 12.
12 in 1988?
Oh, I turned 12 in 88. Yeah.
So you're a child of the 70s.
Yes, I'm a bicentennial boy.
Oh, baby. That's right.
Right. We've had that conversation before.
Yeah, you were born the same year as my sister. My youngest sister is a bicentennial baby.
Yes, I think she's like a month or two older than me.
She was born in November.
Okay, so she's a month younger than me.
A little less than a month younger than you.
True.
So, yeah. At any rate, so in 1988, I was given a cassette tape from a group called Friends of Israel. And it told the story of the rebirth of Israel. And it also told the story of the involvement of President Harry S. Truman in the rebirth of Israel. And I never forgot that amazing, remarkable story. And I had heard it told here and there, but I felt like it needed to be documented in a book. And so I actually spent 3+ years doing the research for this book. I started out at the Truman Library in Independence, just outside of Kansas City, Missouri, doing research. And then I continued doing research over the next 3 years. I ended up writing the book, and there are more than 1,200 endnotes documenting the information. So my purpose in writing the book was twofold. One, I wanted to tell this story in such a way that was readable and that people would want to keep turning the pages. The other reason was to defend, to create a defense of the rebirth of Israel that could be argued before the Supreme Court, that it would have the strong arguments in place so that you could go before the Supreme Court and say, this is why it was not only just for Israel to be reborn, but it was critical for Israel to be reborn in the land of what the Jews call Eretz Israel, and what the Romans changed the name to Palestine. Okay. And they named it Palestine after the Jews' old enemies from the Old Testament, the Philistines. Mm-hmm. And so they called it the land of the Philistines to rub in the nose of the Jews after the Romans defeated the Jews first in AD 70, but then again after the Bar Kokhba revolt several decades later. And in both of those battles, the Romans just utterly destroyed the Jews and sent them to all the four corners of the world. And so the Jews were left without a homeland, even though we need to remember, John, that the Jewish nation is one of the most ancient peoples on the earth. The only other people that that are still around that could match up to the ancient level of the Jews are the Egyptians, the Chinese, and the Indians, and not many more.
Right.
No one would consider it wrong for the Egyptians to live in the land of Egypt. No one considered it wrong for the Indians to be in India or the Chinese to be in China. And yet there are people today who are saying that Israel is illegitimate, that it does not have claim to the land that they were in 3,000 years ago, and that it was immoral and colonialism for them to come into that land and to reestablish themselves as a nation in Palestine. They say that they kicked the Palestinian Arabs out and that they took over. This book makes it very clear that that is not what happened.
I'm just trying to grasp the concept that in the 1980s, while everybody's getting cassette tapes with music on it, you're getting cassette tapes with stuff about Harry S. Truman
and loving it.
And love. Maybe that's coming from a 12-year-old's perspective. That
yes. Remember, John, that I'm more than 10 years older than you. So by this point, I'm in my early 20s.
But still, as a 22-year-old, I was listening to music. Obviously, by then, it wasn't cassette tapes. It was more CDs than anything. But and now those are kind of passé.
Well, I think I've told you that I did 6 years of history in high school. Yes. And the reason was that I
couldn't get out of history as fast as...
See, I couldn't get enough of it. I went to a Christian private school for 9th and 10th grade, and it was basically go at your own pace kind of school. And so you needed to get everything done by a certain time. But if there was a particular area that you were more interested in and you had all your other work done, you could keep working. And so I went through 2 years in 9th grade and 2 years in 10th grade. So I finished 4 years of history in 2 years. Well, then I transferred to a public school and they didn't count those extra 2 years. So I got to take another 2 more years of history. And so when I was getting ready to go to college, I was seriously considering majoring in history, but nobody could tell me how I could make a living. And so I decided to minor in history instead. And so right around the time of my graduation, somebody gave me a cassette tape from Friends of Israel about the rebirth of Israel and Harry Truman. And I loved it because I love history.
Do you still have that cassette tape?
It has long since been lost. I don't know where it is.
What a
But
shame.
I'd love,
What a shame.
if anybody has one that they could send me a digital copy, I would absolutely love to have that. It's Friends of Israel and the story of the rebirth of Israel and of Harry S. Truman and his Jewish business partner, who was very instrumental in convincing Truman to recognize Israel when they declared independence.
It'd be a trip down memory lane for Craig.
I would love
As
it.
he
If anybody has one, that would be a lovely gift.
As he taps into his 80s self.
Exactly.
So
right.
Going back to the actual story in the news today, so many people in the media are blaming Israel for the rocket attacks from Hamas terrorists. Do you think this is
Hamas.
true? Hamas.
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 Yeah.
Oh. You say potato, I say potato.
Right.
I'm kidding.
But potato is the correct saying, pronunciation. Hamas, is the correct pronunciation.
The Hamas terrorists. And do you think this is true? And can you give some historical perspectives to help people understand what is actually going on in the Middle East?
It is absolutely false. Imagine if the Canadians and the Mexicans and the Cubans were sending rockets into our cities. Imagine if the Cubans were sending these rockets with explosives into Miami. Would we put up with that for half a day, for an hour, for a few minutes? Absolutely not. If the Mexicans were sending rockets into San Diego or Phoenix, would we put up with that? If the Canadians were bombing Erie, Pennsylvania, my hometown, would the United States put up with this? Especially they would not put up with Erie being shelled by the Canadians, which they did back in the War of 1812. But I
patriotic city.
What's that?
That patriotic city.
Exactly.
Stalwart of patriotism.
That's right, where they built the ships. We'll do a show one time on the building of the ships that won the Battle of Lake Erie, because those were built only a mile away from my home.
Kelly commented, maybe with this administration, and then thinking.
Yeah. We're not gonna dip into politics. We stay in the historical realm here. But at any rate, no, we would not put up with it. And Israel is a sovereign nation, and it has rights as a sovereign nation to defend itself against attacks. And it really it doesn't matter whether or not you think that whatever your thoughts are with regard to the rebirth of Israel. These are terrorists who are shooting rockets into cities. And just yesterday, a 5-year-old boy was killed and his mother was terribly wounded by a rocket that blew up on the street as they're just walking innocently down the street in Israel. And we need to remember what this is. You see these rockets flying through the air and you think, oh, wow, isn't that interesting? But we forget that there are people being wounded, people being killed as a result. And so Israel has the right to defend themselves. Now, let me go back and reiterate why Israel has the right. We need to recognize that Palestine was a state within the Ottoman Empire. And the Turks who ran the Ottoman Empire looked at Palestine basically as a backwater that they didn't really care about. They just wanted to collect taxes from them. And so this land that had been the land of the promised land of the Bible, flowing with milk and honey, by this point had been so neglected that the desert was starting to overtake it. And so when Mark Twain went as a tourist to Israel in the 1860s, he said, and I have this in the I Am Cyrus book, he said it was a barren wasteland and that it was one of the most depressing places he had ever seen in his life. And so when the Jews had always wanted to go back to Israel, back to their promised land, but they were never allowed in because it was occupied throughout the years by different groups that didn't want to let the Jews back into the land. And so the most recent of those was the Ottoman Turks. But what had happened is that the Ottomans had gotten into so much debt that they stopped paying attention to Israel or to the Palestine area. And they were focusing on how to get out of the debt that they had built up to foreign creditors. And so the land was pretty much wide open and undefended. And so what happened is that in the 1880s, there was an assassination of the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Alexander II. And one of the plotters in the conspiracy was Jewish. And so the Russian government used that as an excuse to unleash what they called a pogrom against the Jews. And this was a government-sponsored attack where they would beat them, they would destroy their property, and sometimes Jews would even be killed. There were rapes and all kinds of awful things that would happen. And all of it was sanctioned by the government against the Jewish people to basically remind them, you are not Russians. You're not part of us. You are aliens. And we are only allowing you here just basically because we have no other choice because we can't get rid of all of you. And so they would keep this persecution and this racism, this anti-Semitism against the Jews, but it was highly increased after the Tsar was assassinated. And so there were a group of Jewish leaders in the 1880s who finally said, we've had enough. This has got to stop. And later, David Ben-Gurion, who became the first prime minister of Israel, said, we Jews committed the sin of not being strong. And we will never commit that sin again. And so what you're seeing today is Israel defending itself. And it has, you need to realize that Israel, modern day Israel, is the size of New Jersey. And yet it has enemies all around it, these massive nations who would like to, for political reasons, for religious reasons, for whatever reason it might be, just hatred, they want to drive the Jews into the sea and they want to take over their land. And so the Jews really don't have the luxury of being passive when they are attacked. They have to defend themselves in order to stay alive, in order to survive. They must defend themselves. Now, I was in Israel in the year 2003, and our tour was allowed to go on to a couple of the military bases. And we went to a helicopter attack base. We actually got in. I sat down in the pilot's seat of one of these attack helicopters. And the person giving us the tour was a general. He was the very first general of the helicopter forces in the nation of Israel. And he said, we as Jews following Judaism, life is precious. It doesn't matter if you're a German or English or American or Arab. Life is precious. And innocent life to us is sacred. He said, so when we attack, we do everything we can to make sure that we are only hitting military or terrorist targets. And so he said, we have developed, and remember, this is 2003. So that's 18 years ago. Things have come a long way since then. But he said, we have developed pinpoint accurate missiles on our helicopters. So we can come in, if we know that a terrorist is in one particular hotel room, we can hover outside of that hotel, a mile away or however long. We could shoot this missile into the window of that hotel room and destroy that hotel room without hurting anyone in the rooms to the right or to the left. That was in 2003. So the attacks that they make are not meant to hurt civilians. Now, sometimes in a war situation, and especially in an urban situation, there are innocent people that are hit, and that's called collateral damage. But they do their best in the Israeli Defense Forces to avoid that whenever possible. Hamas knows this, and so quite often they will put themselves into a place that's surrounded by innocent civilians to use as a shield, knowing that the Jews care so much about human life. But when the Jews are being attacked with hundreds and hundreds of rockets that are coming into their country, they have to defend themselves. And so sometimes, unfortunately, innocent people will be wounded or killed in the midst of that, but it's not their desire whatsoever. I highly recommend, if you are interested in knowing more about the rebirth of Israel and how it all came about, to check out this book, I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman and the Rebirth of Israel. One of the things when people say to me that Israel stole the land of Palestine, first of all, I remind them that Israel was there 3,000 years, and that many of the Arabs that were there were only there for maybe 100 years before Israel came in and started rebuilding the land. But the other thing that I tell them is, how big is the state of Israel? I already said it here. It's the size of New Jersey, okay? So think about the size of New Jersey. It's one of the smallest states in the United States. How many Arab countries are there, and how far do they stretch? Do you know?
No, there's quite a bit. Especially in the not past couple years, but I think it's expanded since I was in school. Well, and they're a lot bigger than Israel.
The Arab nations stretch from Morocco on the Atlantic coast across northern Africa, all the way through Saudi Arabia to the border of Iran, from the border of Turkey all the way down to Yemen. And it encompasses hundreds of millions of acres, hundreds of millions of people. I
have a quick question about does it go over farther east into like the countries of Pakistan and Afghanistan?
No, those are not Arab countries.
I know they're Muslim, but I didn't know if there was any Arab contingencies, I guess, or signals.
Arabia ends with Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
On the border, and Iraq. Iraq is an Arab state, and it is on the border of Iran. Iran and Iraq share a border.
Right.
And so that's how far the Arab nations go. But then if you expand it to Muslim nations, it goes from Morocco all the way over into Jakarta or down into Indonesia.
Wow.
It spreads into quite a bit of India, part of China. Then it goes up into all of the former Soviet republics that were all Islamic. So Afghanistan, Pakistan, which used to be part of India, the other republics like Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan, and all those different
Georgia,
all those different areas there on the southern part of Russia. Those are all Muslim nations. And how many Jewish nations are there?
One.
And how big is it?
The size of the Garden State.
And people want to take that away. Does that not smack of anti-Semitism to you?
Oh, absolutely.
Especially since the Jews have been there since the time of the pharaohs.
That's what I was going to say. Since they've been there, as you said at the beginning, they've been there longer than most other ethnic peoples. Outside of the Egyptians, the Indians, the Chinese, and I think there's one other.
A handful of others.
Okay, a handful. But yeah.
But not many. There are not many. Yeah. And I can look that up between now and next week to see exactly the order
Mhm.
of the ages of the nations. I believe Egypt is still the oldest, but let me check on that to let you know for sure. But it is a remarkable thing, and so people need to look at things in perspective and recognize that Israel had the right to go back to their own land, and when they went back in, they started to rebuild that country. They drained malarial swamps that were killing people with malaria, and they blew up using dynamite. They exploded the rocks, and then they used plows, many times donkeys and horses going behind plows, plowing up the land. And then they'd pull out these huge boulders and they pull out these stumps. And then they started planting things, and much of the things that they planted died at first because it was so dry. And so they were planting basically in sand. And so, but what they came to realize, in part because of the help of Rothschild in France, Baron Rothschild sent his horticulture experts to help them find things that would grow. And they found out that citrus and vineyards did very well in that kind of soil. And to this day, Israel is one of the largest growers of citrus and has some of the best vineyards in the entire world. Part of the reason is that Rothschild took clippings from his own vineyards that were world-class, some of the best vineyards in France, and he transplanted those to Israel. And so now the wine that Israel makes is some of the best wine in the world because it came from the French stock. Yeah. So it's pretty interesting.
And the French know their wines.
Exactly. And the Israelis know their wines very well also.
That's interesting. I never knew that about Israelis.
Yeah.
About Israeli wine.
So there's deep reasons why Israel has a right to the land. But another thing that I think is very important is that the nations of the world were sympathetic to the argument of the Zionists because 6 million Jews had been murdered by the Nazis. And the Zionists said, this is what we have been saying since the 1880s, and really for hundreds of years, but specifically the Zionist movement was born in the 1880s. And they said 80 years later, or not 80 years later, but 60 years later, during the Holocaust, 55, 60 years later, they were saying, this is what we've been saying all these years, that we don't have a place of safety. There is no safe haven. We must have our own land, or there will continue to be the Holocaust, the pogroms, the Spanish Inquisitions, and even England. Now we look at Great Britain as supposedly this civilized nation. England was one of the first places that the Jews had ever received persecution and were literally expelled by the king.
Oh, wow.
And so it really doesn't matter where they went. The Jews, because they were different, because they were their own people with their own culture, their own language, their own religion, they were persecuted as being different, being outsiders. And so they needed to have a safe haven, a nation. There are people who complain about nations today, but what they don't realize is nations are formed to protect that people group. It's formed in a way to protect them economically, to protect their culture, to protect their religions, their language, their way of thinking. And nations have the right and the authority to raise armies and to either manufacture or buy weapons to protect themselves. There's international law that says that a nation is allowed to protect itself. Well, the Jews did not have a nation, and therefore they couldn't get those kind of heavy weapons, tanks and machine guns and rockets to protect themselves until they became a nation. And now that they are a nation, they have every right to protect themselves against terrorists and against these rockets.
Well, let me ask you a question, kind of relating it back to the current situation that's going on over there in Israel. In your expert opinion, what do you think is going to happen? What's the ultimate outcome? I know what your desired and what all of our desired outcome would be. But in your expert opinion, is that what you see is going to happen or think is
Well,
going to
tell me,
happen?
what is it that you're saying? You said, I know that what we desire, is it going to be? What is the it that you're talking about?
That they're going to be able to stand up and stay within and stay in Israel and I guess prevent these other nations from taking over Israel.
I believe that we made tremendous strides under the Trump administration. And whatever you may think about him politically or personally, he was, according to most Israelis, next to Harry S. Truman, he was the best president and the most friendly president to Israel that they ever had. And so that is why he was able to broker these peace deals between Israel and Saudi Arabia, between Israel and Yemen, and between other nations. And so there was an amazing and really refreshing, in my opinion, 4 years of peace in the Middle East. And a lot of that credit has to go to Netanyahu and Trump for their agreements and for their cooperation in trying to build trust in that region. And so we are seeing a lot of the Arab nations are starting to realize that it's in their best interest to have peace accords with the Israelis. But there are individual groups, and specifically terrorist groups like Hezbollah, Hamas. In Egypt, you have the Muslim Brotherhood. You have other jihadists that have different agendas, and these groups they want nothing more than to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Now, let's look at it theologically, and this is one of the things that if you watch the nightly news, you never hear anything about theology. I never hear any expert talking about theology, and yet in order to understand what's going on, you're foolish to ignore the theology of the situation. So here's theological background behind a lot of these jihadist groups, is that they believe, because the Quran states that any land that is defeated in jihad, in a holy war, that land is forever owned by Islam, and no other nation, no other belief system can have that land. Well, because Palestine was controlled by several different Muslim groups, including Saladin and the Egyptian Mamelukes and the Ottoman Turks. All of these were Muslim groups, and they controlled all of the land of Eretz Israel, which the Romans called Palestine. So in the mind of the jihadists and the fundamentalist Muslims, going from a fundamentalist reading of the Quran, Israel cannot exist in that nation. It must be destroyed. It must be pushed out, because the Jews are living on Muslim land in their minds. And that is why, there have been amazing peace deals offered to the Palestinians over the years, and they will never agree to a peace deal, or they haven't as of this time. The Oslo Peace Accords made unbelievable offers. Prime Minister Barack, working with Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, they made unbelievable deal to Yasser Arafat, and everyone thought he was going to say yes, and he said no. And I would encourage you to read my book, because you will realize why he said no to that peace deal, and you'll realize what family Yasser Arafat comes from, and their history of the dealings with the Jews and with other anti-Semitic groups, including the Nazis. So,
Wow.
it's deep stuff. It's theological. It is political. And so the answer to your question is, I don't believe there will ultimately be peace in Israel until the return of the Prince of Peace, which is Jesus Christ. Because we live in a fallen world, and the Bible says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and the rulers of the darkness of this world. And there are spiritual forces at play. And because Israel is, they are the chosen people of God, and the Bible says forever they will be the chosen people of God. And so any kind of replacement theology is not biblical. It is not true to God's unending covenant with Israel. And so that's why Paul said we as Christians need to understand that we have been grafted in to the tree, which is the people of God, Israel. And so Christians are the new Israel, but we haven't replaced them. We've joined them as the people, the covenant people of God. And that is why it's so vitally important for Christians and Bible-believing Christians to support our brothers and sisters, the Jews, and to defend the nation of Israel. And that's what I set out to do in this book. And I highly recommend, if anyone's interested in understanding what really is going on, to check this out. Once again, I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman, and the Rebirth of Israel.
Very cool.
So we've only got a few more minutes left, and so we have to wrap it up with our customary question about NASCAR. And
Yes.
John C. Farrell's book, What Every Dummy Needs to Know About NASCAR, right? Oh no, the official NASCAR trivia book. I thought it was NASCAR for Dummies, but
Actually, I did help ghostwrite the NASCAR. It was actually written by Mark Martin, but I am one of the people I worked with. I got him to ghostwrite it, and I actually helped out a little bit with that too. So,
all right. So my NASCAR question of the week, which will be answered from the official NASCAR book for Dummies by John C. Farrell, is today, whenever I am clicking through the channels and stop for about 2 seconds to see a NASCAR thing and then keep clicking, but I do notice that they've got uniforms that have all these little decals and tags that are all over them, but they almost look like they're in a space suit getting into their cars. But that wasn't always the case. There were all kinds, before NASCAR really got coordinated and organized and unionized and whatever they are. They didn't have such strict rules, and there were people who would dress in all kinds of interesting ways. So tell us one or two stories about this interesting.
Absolutely. So yeah. Actually, today they're more like walking billboards because their uniforms are covered in all kinds of sponsor patches. And so, but back in the 50s and 60s, and even on into the 70s, the rules and regulations that NASCAR's sanctioning body had was, as I guess we could say, was less stringent and not even there. So I have three small, very short anecdotes that I want to give you about some of the things that went on back in the 50s and 60s, and these are just three examples. There's tons of other things too that there could be a long discussion about what some of these drivers did back then. But the first one takes place in 1950. A driver by the name of Jimmy Florian. He won at I don't know the race's name, but he won at the Daytona Speedway in Ohio. And when he got
Daytona, I thought it was in Florida.
Dayton. Sorry.
I was going to say, wait a second here.
I added an A where there shouldn't have been. It's Dayton Speedway in Ohio. Gotcha. Thank you for the catch. Well, it turns out when he crossed the finish line and he got out of the car, there was something unusual about what he was wearing. He was bare-chested. He had taken his shirt off in the middle of the race because, as he says, he was unusually hot, and there was nothing in the NASCAR rulebook that stated a driver was required to wear a shirt during a race. So because of the unimaginable heats. Nowadays in a NASCAR car, they have vents that take all the heat from the engine and route it out underneath the car to go out through the back of the car. Whereas back in the 50s, that wasn't a thing. All the heat just built up into the cockpit of the race cars. So it did get extremely hot. And this is June 25th, and it was in Ohio. So I'm imagine how sweltering hot it might have been. And so, but he won the actual race wearing no shirt, which I always found amazing, because that you're not going to see that nowadays. And then another situation, or another occurrence, came just a year later in November in Gardena, California, at Carroll Speedway. And NASCAR star Fonty Flock, he was always kind of living on the edge. You heard 2 weeks ago about his brother Fonty Flock, who drove with a
Monkey Man,
with a monkey, with Jocko Flocky. Well, actually, Fonty drove wearing Bermuda shorts, knee socks, and nice shoes because he wanted to look his best for a race day. And so, but he was outdone by another guy in 1966 at Columbia Speedway in South Carolina. Again, it's Columbia Speedway,
in our backyard.
Right, absolutely. And it's no longer a NASCAR sanctioned race for at least Premier Series or National Series races. But there's a guy by the name of Curtis Turner who has won the championship before. He was told by his owner that he needed to look good while driving. So he showed up at Columbia Speedway wearing nothing but a 3-piece business suit. And so he is quoted as saying, Johnson's sponsor, Holly Farms Poultry, told me that if I was going to drive for them, I would have to wear a suit. They wanted me to be a gentleman driver, and I figured this was the first step. You got to look good, you know. And that was a quote directly from Curtis Turner on the stipulation that his sponsor, Holly Farms Poultry, wanted their drivers to look good. And so they didn't specify how he had to look good. He just interpreted as, hey, I got to wear a 3-piece suit. And so he actually raced at Columbia Speedway in 1966 in November. So it was a little cooler, although it's still South Carolina. It's still can be pretty hot. But he wore a 3-piece suit in the middle of the race. He did not win the race, however, but he did.
You would think that if he was in a suit,
right,
he would have won the race. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and
he finished third.
Oh, well, that's pretty. He looked good doing it. So
right. And so,
all right. Well, thank you
for that's in here.
All of these are in the official NASCAR book for dummies, written by.
For dummies. That's a totally different book.
Oh, what's the title? One more time.
The official NASCAR trivia book.
NASCAR trivia book by John C. Farrell, available on Amazon.com.
And yes,
that's
Kelly,
all the time that we. What's that?
Kelly commented. I was just commented.
But he looked good. Yes, he did. Yes. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for tonight's issue of Stories and Myths. If you do have a question that you'd like for us to cover, please send it to my website, which is vonbusick.com, VONBUSECK. And right in the top, there's a contact button. Go ahead and send that question to us, and we'd be happy to answer it on the air. Or if you're tuning in, you can put it into the chat room, and we'd be happy to do that. So we will be back once again next Thursday night, 7 p.m. Eastern U.S. time for Stories and Myths. So for John C. Farrell, I'm Craig Von Busick. Have a wonderful evening and good night.
Good night, y'all.